I've always been very interested in cities. So at the same time, I come from a quantitative background. I was trained as a physicist. So what I tried to do is really, out of my personal passion, my training, to put those things together and try to generate a better understanding of what cities are and how they work and how they generate the kind of change that we see now throughout the world. My current work, so we've had a group now at the Santa Fe Institute maybe for 12 years that we've been looking systematically about what could we know, what could we measure about cities. And in this time, really, there's been an enormous revolution in particularly the information that's being generated by people and activities in cities, as well as sort of the built space and organization of cities, so sort of their more physical aspects. So our research, when it started, it was really about looking at entire cities and try to capture their properties and try to relate properties to each other. So for example, there are certain things you can relate to city size, like the size of the economy or the density of a city. Those are natural things. And those relationships are things that you can then analyze throughout, in different nations or even through history. You can see how they changed over time. Of course, technology, culture, and all these things have changed, so you have to factor that in. But nevertheless, what you find then is sort of as just the baseline is that cities at that level as entire entities without looking inside, but we'll get to that in a second, really have relatively quite predictable properties. So you can tell, for example, that as cities get larger, they tend to have larger economies per capita. So that means that effectively as cities grow, things get more expensive, but people also earn more money, something you're familiar with here in in Singapore. But this is actually a general phenomenon that you see throughout the world. And whether you're in Nigeria or in the United States or in Japan, the baselines for wealth are different, but Tokyo or Lagos or New York will be more expensive than smaller cities. But also we'll have a bunch of other things. We'll have a denser occupation of space, we'll have also more congestion. But we'll have also increasingly, this then depends on level of development, but we'll start generating tall buildings and things that you kind of see, but also a variety of economic activity, not just more money, but sort of having a more diverse sort of fabric that's both economic and social. And so all these things become predictable, but what's interesting is that they're entangled, so you can predict some from others. And so often some things are easier to measure than others. So for example, when we look at developing cities, it's often easier still, though the situation is changing quickly, to look at their occupation of space, right? Because you can measure that from a satellite photo, for example. But then you can start inferring things about their economy and the diversity of their sort of economic composition and other things. So a lot of my research has gone then from understanding these general patterns that we've analyzed now in many, many countries and throughout history and continue to do so, to start looking inside the city and start looking at the city over time more explicitly. So that was always implicit, but now it's more explicit. And that's a little richer and more complicated, but it's very important because when you look at any city, you find, for example, that there's enormous disparities, inequalities, diversities, heterogeneities inside the city. So you always have rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods, commercial neighborhoods and residential neighborhoods, and this of different kinds, different ethnicities, all kinds of things. So cities really sustain a lot of diversity and a lot of also inequality. And these patterns too are predictable in a certain way. And that becomes really interesting because there is a set of questions that we really don't understand very well, but they're critical for growth and development. Things like, are there levels of inequality that become very problematic for a city in terms of continue to generate innovation and development? Or, so the picture that emerged from the earlier studies is that you should really think of a city as primarily people that are networked together trying to do all the things that they do, like this and many other things. And so so this picture starts asking the question whether if someone moves to a city and that city is developing, what are the opportunities that they have in terms of social and economic things they can do, but also where can they live and why is it that some cities are more mixed than others and other cities don't appear mixed, but people mix through transportation. So those are many of the patterns that you see of this variety and change and diversity that you find inside cities. And in a recent paper, we've been applying this to try to explicitly link them to ideas of sustainable development. So, of course, there's an economic component related, for example, to incomes, but you can start looking at, for example, what kind of services people have. So if you look at a developing city like in Brazil or in South Africa, these are the cases we use, but also some places in Africa, you find that the level of services that people have varies a lot from neighborhood to neighborhood. And with the arc of development, people have more services, but this is also initially creates a lot of inequality, which can be bad. And so you can start understanding the trajectory of cities not just in terms of average things, but in terms of different places and different people and how this affects them. And this then gives you a much richer view of the city as sort of a heterogeneous network. And then it starts also telling you a little bit about what development really is, not at a macro level, for which we've had a little bit of economic theory, though it's not very good, but at the micro level. What is the experience of the individual, the household, perhaps the neighborhood, in terms of development? And so this is something that we know, we experience it ourselves, so we have a lot of intuition for it, but we really have not had a science of development and growth in terms of what it means for an individual and what kind of changes, therefore, in policy and for a planning you'd like to propitiate such that that happens. So some can, some cannot. And in fact, a lot of such things are more measurable now than they used to be. But to your point, many things are not, it's very hard to measure happiness or even quality of life is sort of a difficult concept. But increasingly, so that is absolutely true and one should always remember. But having said that, a lot of developed cities, I'm not sure how you feel here in Singapore, but like famously New York and other places, people are not happy. They'll tell you they're not happy, even though they often have a standard of living that's much higher than in other places they're poor. So anyway, it may be a tricky thing to measure anyway, even if you could. But the point is that, okay, so there are two things that are sort of important. One thing is that both out of the initiative of cities, and you see this certainly in the United States, this has become common. You go to New York or LA and many other cities, they have now a plan. And I think Singapore also now has a plan that says, effectively, things that are not just about macroeconomics, but have to do with quality of life, health, inclusion, and these in ways that are measurable. So you can measure, for example, respiratory diseases or levels of course, employment, unemployment, but also sort of other aspects of this. So there are some of it that is measurable, and that is becoming consensual, meaning that most cities and most societies are thinking that such measures are desirable and are working towards them. This is particularly clear with climate change, right, and sort of sustainability things more associated with energy and so for example, how much of your energy is green and renewable, or what's air quality in the city, or levels of noise. These are things then that may not reflect necessarily happiness, but that start affecting people and are local, so they often are different from one neighborhood to another, and that can be measured. And that most cities now are saying these are our objectives, for example, to recycle everything and to have green energy to a certain level in 15 or 20 years. And this is now also being implemented globally, for example, in terms of sustainable development goals, which are all meant now to be measurable. So even when they deal with things like people's rights and obligations, education, the condition of women and children, the idea is that even though it is true that we cannot measure all these things fully, and we should always remember that, it's good to have some base measures that we should aim for, because then we know how far away we may be. So it's a two-step process that really is important to recognize. One is that, on the one hand, the measurement is imperfect, but gives you a path to improvement and something to keep you honest, right, and know how wrong you might be. On the other hand, you recognize that those measures are imperfect, and you should actually use judgment and have other information to judge how well you're actually doing. But this trend to actually have, it started certainly with the Millennium Development Goals, but it's common now in cities, to have goals. There are long-term goals, there are ambitious goals. They're basically solving problems that humanity has always struggled with, poverty, rights, inclusion, environmental issues, I think is really important. And it's really creating a process by which people in science, like me, people in technology that generate sort of the devices and the algorithms by which we can collect and manipulate data, and people in planning and policy, and also citizens and nonprofits, can start agreeing on objectives, but also working together in terms of creating data, analyzing data, assessing these things, and then improving those assessments such that not in a definite way, but in an incremental way, you get closer to things that matter to people. It is important to have a vision, which is not a detailed vision exactly how to get there, but it's a vision of what are the values and aspirations of a city or of a society. And then to start thinking about all the new possibilities, new and some old, to measure some aspects of it and assess if we're doing better getting there. My experience, for example, in Singapore has been very interesting because I've been coming here now for a few years. And through a series of opportunities, I talked, for example, and a lot of people at the Housing Development Board. And I was always very curious to understand how they assessed their success. Because it's notoriously difficult. Public housing is a very difficult thing to get right or even be marginally successful. And I was also in a committee where we were encouraging several agencies in Singapore to collect more data and do the kind of things we were just discussing. And what was interesting, and what to me at some point was a revelation after many conversations, was that actually the people involved in the different agencies, including HDB, actually have a very good understanding of the processes, but they were not collecting data, to your point. They had a sense of if things were broken or working, if the community was happy with their housing and so forth. So often we need a mixture of both judgment and observation and hard data. But the most important thing is to have sort of a sense of if we're achieving our objectives or not. But so it's dangerous to just think I'm going to collect all the data in the world, I'm going to solve all my problems and it'll be done. That doesn't work that way. But at the same time, it's very important to recognize that we have many new opportunities to understand cities much better, to understand them in detail, to get closer to the person or the household experience, which is what matters. And therefore, planners, governments, but also citizens can have a much richer sense of how well the city is doing, how good the urban environment is, and therefore have anchors that allow you to improve that. And that's really important. It's really fundamental that we can hang on to information as a marker of where you are, and then as an assessment of where you want to go. Whatever you might measure today in 2016 may be quite different. I mean, some things may be similar, some things the method by which you measure it will change, but the pace of technology has been so incredible that in 2 or 3 or 4, or certainly 10 years, it's likely that what we can measure and assess will be different. And so it does require a certain presence of mind always to think about what's really important, what is it I'm trying to do, and then from that point of view, ask what is it I can measure easily and simply that gives me a good sense whether I'm achieving that or not. And what is it I can maybe ask people, or there may be things that are sort of hard data and the things that are more softer data and collective judgment. And those things are both important. It's important often to have objective measures such that you don't fool yourself into thinking you're doing better than you are, but you also have to recognize that some of the problems that are really important are hard to assess with just hard data. So it's a very interesting time because I think we really have gone through a revolution of what we can know about cities. That was the first point we discussed, right? So if you go back even certainly 20 years, maybe 10 years, most cities in the world had really very little idea of most things that they do. Maybe some services would have quality of water or traffic levels, things like this. But now you can basically track every car and know where it is now, right? So you see that on your phone. And you can measure, air quality immediately, and you also can have a sense of how people use urban spaces also through cell phones and mobility. And you have also opportunities for people to express their priorities and map their neighborhoods and map the services that they have and tell you how much time and money they're spending doing one thing or another. And it's also easy to organize this data and to create sort of aggregate measures that tell you how well you're progressing or not. So so this just happened, and particularly all the spatially related things with GIS information and so forth is over the last maybe 5 years. And for developed cities, this is important because it gives you a certain sense of a much richer, localized in space and time sense of how they work. But the big revolution, but these cities in some sense have fewer spatial and physical problems. They still have often social and economic issues at their own level. But when you go to developing cities, this is an enormous revolution. Most developing cities, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe with some exception in South Africa and a few other places, or India, for example, which is immense, or many other parts of Asia, they don't have a cadastral map. They don't have a map of most of their cities, particularly most of the neighborhoods that are informal. They don't know much about their own infrastructure, what exists, what's broken, particularly in terms of quality of service and condition, what's broken, what's not broken, what people consider as a problem, what things people consider as less of a problem. And so you can now have a development of a physical city that really happens hand in hand with the socioeconomic city in a way that you couldn't do before. So this is, I think, very important in terms of planning. Asks, again, planners all the questions we already discussed, but even from a point of view now of a process of profound change. And I think it allows for new models of participatory planning and ways to capture information, again, from individuals, households, neighborhoods at a level that a planner could never have in the past. And so it's how different cities are using this information that is very interesting. So now there's a variety of things that you see throughout the world. When I come here or in the United States, the places that are doing best are places that know how to collect data, are installing things, are opening some of the data, often about operations of the city. I think we're still, in developed cities, we're still finding how the data that we can collect, to your point just in the previous question, can really make a big difference. So I think a lot of the instincts that people have been using have to do with, I can improve city operations, like I can maybe run the buses a little bit better, or the metro. So for example, if I see how many people are waiting, I can now have sort of a control algorithm that dispatches the buses or the trains in a way that's more adaptive than before. Or I can make sure the trash is collected, or the health inspections or things like this are done on time and so forth. That's interesting, and it's important to have a city work well, but in some sense I think it still misses this larger point that, going back to quality of life and happiness and people's aspirations, how do you measure these other things? They're really, in the end, are the things that matter the most. The first things need to be done, but these other things are really essential, and are the ones in which a city will be judged and frankly financed and so forth. So, so I think that I see at the moment, but at the same time you see already, I think there was a big revolution, for example, in transportation. So what this data, but more to the point, what the users of data are becoming really powerful at, is in allowing things that always existed in cities. So in cities, the nature of life is that you need to do many different things over space and time, right? So when, there are different shops, take kids to school, go to work. So you do many things throughout the day that are different. And you meet people, right? So it allows you to coordinate all these things much more effectively. So whether it is Google Maps or Apple Maps or somebody else's maps that allows you to use space, particularly in a city you don't know so well, or whether, and then of course somebody can come up and have an Uber or a share economy application that can start using space and where people are and where businesses are to coordinate things better and to share resources. So that's a set of applications that's interesting and that's really happening, but it's coming more from the business world. Or in transportation, where it is knowing, when you take the metro, then you can take whether the bus or something else, such that you coordinate it and don't waste time. That's really changing things. So it's almost like the big changes have been in the software of cities, the way they operate, rather than in the hardware of cities, changing hard infrastructure so fast. But these aspects of coordinating life and making it more efficient, meeting people so that you don't wait so long, et cetera, are really working much better because of technology and data, but they're not sort of coming from government necessarily. I think we're still struggling to find good civic and sort of planning applications of a lot of this data that makes a big difference. Many are making already some difference, but makes an even bigger difference. I think in planning developing cities and making these cities reflect all the balances that we discussed, there's really an enormous potential. And it's happening in many interesting cities in India and parts of Africa and parts of Latin America. And that's really, it's both a difficult environment, it's an environment that may hopefully generate a lot of change towards sustainable development much faster than we thought was possible.